For my final project, I decided to do a feminist reading of The Handmaid's Tale. To begin, I'd like to provide an overview or a general introduction and answer the question, what material does Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale cover? Before getting into the elements that qualify this text as a feminist science fiction novel, I'd like to provide some general information and an overview or introduction of the novel. This novel was first published by Margaret Atwood in the year 1985. This is already nearing the end, if not already qualifying it as the end of the second wave of feminism. This can be seen in the way that the novel is sort of a reaction or a commentary on patriarchy and the way that it handles themes relevant to this second wave of feminism. The setting is a near-futuristic United States in which a totalitarian theocracy has overthrown the government. This was done by a Christian nationalist group done through a coup. It takes place in the United States, but now it's no longer known as such. It's recognized as the Republic of Gilead. The Republic has now become a surveillance state monitoring the lives of women as they live under reproductive servitude. And by reproductive servitude, I mean that women are tied to their biological value and their ability to produce children. So women qualified as handmaids are those that have viable wombs and can produce children, especially for elite couples. And the system is in place to combat declining birth rates. The cast of characters is mainly female dominated, but our main character or protagonist is known as Alfred, and she used to live a normal life prior to the overthrowing of the government. She had a husband and a daughter and was well off on her own. However, now in the Republic of Gilead, she lives as a handmaid, which is used to reproduce, and she lives with a man known as the commander and his wife, and she exists to provide a child for them and bear the child for them. On the right, we have a picture of the Republic of Gilead. The tan areas will represent the areas that are in control of the people. The blue-green areas are those that are commanded by the rebels or anyone trying to fight back. And then the red represents the wastelands, or also known as the colonies, which are used as punishment to send women who are unable to produce children, or women and also men that have committed crimes. Now that we've provided some context as to what the novel covers and takes place, I'd like to tackle the specific elements that qualify this text as a feminist science fiction novel. In terms of recognizing the significant elements that qualify this text as such, I'd first like to look at one of the elements that we can observe in Lecture 8 that we saw earlier this semester. So first of all, the novel takes a look at the gender culture and estranges the normalized version of it that we have, and also explores alternatives. Margaret Atwood does this by taking the traditional gender roles that exist in our society today and takes these subtle patriarchal standards and turns them into extreme forms, which she does by transforming the subtlety and making them essential to the functioning of the new system, meaning she makes them a matter of life or death. To do this, she also inextricably intertwines the power systems in place with the patriarchy. So basically, she flips the patriarchal norms on their head by driving them to this extreme form in order to critique them. Most significantly, she also does this by dissolving the nuclear family structure as it detaches all feelings attached to the human experience. By this I mean that she takes away the child and instead replaces the child with the handmaid. So now the family structure is recognized as commander, which is the masculine figure, the wife, which is the feminine figure or the mother figure, and replaces the child with the handmaid in order to fulfill that. She also subverts the normalized gender culture by doing it to an extreme form, and by doing this she classifies women in this universe as second-class citizens, which can be seen in the way that the system in place of in the Republic of Gilead makes it illegal for women to read, write, work, and basically have any individual agency or autonomy over their, not only their reproductive rights and reproductive autonomy, but also just their own individual selves as well. The quote at the bottom reads, "They've frozen them," she said. "Any account with an F on it instead of an M. Women can't hold property anymore," she said. "It's a new law." Through this quotation, we can see the ways in which women are denied of their access to certain methods of maintenance that can provide them with a means of independence outside of their husbands or families, which again ties into the way that women are denied their humanity and treated as second-class citizens under their male masculine figures. It can also be seen in the way that women who fail to conceive are recognized as unwomen and again are denied their humanity simply on their biological basis and their ability to provide children. Another way in which the novel follows the feminist science fiction elements found in the lecture that we covered earlier this semester can be seen in the way that gender roles are constructed in the novel. For example, gender roles are revealed as something learned and cultured, which can be noted in the indoctrination that the handmaids live through at the hands of the aunts. Primarily, the male and female roles are constructed through a biblical basis. The theocracy chooses to reinstate heteronormative ideals. In this world, they like to define and confine women to the domestic space, while men exist to retain the power and are relegated to spaces outside the home. For example, the women experience varying levels of domestic subservience according to their assigned roles. At the highest level would be the wives, which are in blue, and they're the ones that have the most power of the women in this universe. However, they also manage the household. From there, we have the aunts in green, which work to educate and indoctrinate the handmaids, which come after them, which are in red. And then after that, we have the Marthas, which are the homemakers and take care of the servitude in the home. At the end of the day, the Republic of Gilead tends to define social aspects and those attributed to culture and exclusively tie them to our innate biology. This can be seen in the way that the second quotation in the text says, "Men are sex machines, it's nature's way. It's God's device, it's the way things are." By this, the text and the aunts in regurgitating this information show the way that men are just subservient to their own desires instead of attributing them to the means of conversation and how they discuss women and their sexual desires from there. And it can also be seen in the way that the women, the handmaids in this case, internalize this information and come to believe it themselves, which can be seen in the way that Alfred says, "We are two-legged wombs, that's all, sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices." Attributing these aspects on a biological basis eventually results in the dehumanization and commodification of these bodies, which works to not only control the women and keep them in this state of subservience, but essentially allow the Republic to successfully produce children and continue this vicious cycle. From a broader feminist context, the novel also qualifies as such, given the fact that it is a female-centered narrative with a heavily female-dominant cast. It also tackles relevant themes such as objectification, bodily autonomy, and reproductive control. These themes are relevant since they work to critique the patriarchal system in place at an extreme form in the way that they normalize and accept routine forms of violence against women. These focuses also demonstrate and are reflective of second wave feminism in the way that they bring about questions of reproductive rights, the illegitimacy of gender roles, and struggling to attain economic independence given the structural systems in place, as can be seen in the novel, in the way that they are limited in gaining financial freedoms and things as that. The text also illuminates the material and psychological consequences of the patriarchy in the way that women are made to be less than and are treated as less than human. They're poked and prodded for the betterment of the global sense, and they are treated as animals and attributed to their successes in order to the ways that they can provide children for the men. It can also be seen in the way that Alfred says, I want to be held and told my name. I want to be valued in ways that I am not. I want to be more than valuable. I repeat my former name, remind myself of what I once could do, how others saw me. In a world that denies her of an identity beyond her womb viability and fertility, she asks to be recognized as a human once again, given the continuous subjugation she suffered under the Republic. Moving on to further support showing this novel as a feminist science fiction novel, I'd like to cover Adam Bredick and the way that he discusses feminist sci-fi under a post-colonial framework. The novel's overt critique of patriarchal structures has actually led many to believe that Atwood's work done here is a foundational text within the feminist genre, though some do argue over the qualifications under the genre. One of the many scholars that has engaged in the discussion has been Adam Bredick. In his article, A Post-Colonial Feminist Dystopia, he qualifies the novel as part of the genre while also applying a post-colonial lens to analyze the oppression Alfred suffers. Specifically within the text, Bredick notes how the novel places specific emphasis on the most persistent forms of female victimization. These include the sexual exploitation, isolation, and compelled ignorance that is accompanied by severe economic and political powerlessness in society. So he makes this distinction to show how Atwood observes the seemingly normalized and routine forms of violence existing on a structural level in Gilead. He does this to show how the novel very obviously reflects the core issues at the heart of the feminist movement. Specifically, they look at and examine how these works subjugate women and actively harm them in a physical and psychological sense. The exploitation and isolation they experience living in Gilead represents an extreme version of the subtle patriarchal notions that exist at a similar level in our reality. He also notes how Atwood's focus on these exclusively female issues work to critique patriarchy through a deglamorized reality. He also observes the concept of otherness when he says that a handmaid loses her identity and becomes alienated from her inner self. Her name says nothing about her, but reconstructs her identity as a piece of property, describing how the government reduces women and imposes societal bounds by suppressing their identities. He shows in this text how Atwood demonstrates the othering that women experience, given their assigned sex at birth and the way this plays into their lives. Given this, they are stripped of their names, jobs, autonomy, and are reduced to commodities without any sense of humanity. He importantly demonstrates how the system alienates women from themselves, but also those around them, given their cultural value, deeming them incubators instead of people. In doing so, the government and the legal system recognizes their bodily worth while denying them community, agency, and all other experiences that qualify us and provide us with meaning and quantify the human experience. Bredick also observes the novel under a post-colonial lens as he applies the concept of double colonization to the oppression that Alfred experiences. Most notably, he states how the power of state and patriarchy exist as an inseparable unity throughout the novel and the Republic of Gilead. Through this, he notes how women are unable to fight beyond the subjugation they exist under, given that the Republic's power of state is maintained through the enactment of patriarchy. The government system or the legal system are inextricably tied as patriarchy provides the ideals by which the state is regulated, meaning that the generals indoctrinated and delineated by patriarchy define criminality in accordance to the way that the public, so meaning men and women alike, fulfill these roles and fulfill them successfully. With this in mind, Bredick argues that Alfred is not only subjugated by the governing theocracy at a societal level, but also at a communal level by other women in the social hierarchy she experiences. Through surveillance, the women are put at odds with each other as a secondary set of surveillance and maintenance. Through the subjugation and hierarchical caste that they are put into, the women are not allowed to engage in a communal sense at a broad or wide set scale, meaning they are unable to form community and engage in unity, which would help them serve as a compelling force to fight against the Republic of Gilead too. So not only does Offred experience colonization at the level of the patriarchal society she lives in Gilead, but also experiences it at the hands of the women also experiencing similar subjugation to the way that she does as well. Moving on, I'd like to focus on why I chose this novel and what I think it remains a culturally relevant piece, as well as my interpretation of the novel. In terms of my personal interpretation of the novel, I'd say that it exudes relevant themes concerning issues that remain prevalent to our society today. One of the ones that I found most notable was the relevance of dehumanization that is done and experienced by the women living under Gilead. The novel outlines the process by which people are denied their humanity, which obviously can be seen in the way that they are stripped of any and all rights pertaining to them and that were available to them prior to the Republic. And it also emphasizes the way that the culture of demonization and fear-mongering creates spaces for people to see enemies of one another despite experiencing the same subjugation. I feel as though this remains relevant to us nowadays, given the ICE encounters that people are experiencing daily at the hands of our own government. These exist as they perform and reinforce racial stereotypes, which draw conclusions that are unrealistic and untrue about certain groups, which work to create and elicit demonization of these groups despite being marginalized, which work to create separation and prolong unity amongst marginalized groups. Another relevant theme that I think would remain essential to our society today that I think the novel hits well on is the ways in which legality does not equate or equal morality. Through the subjugation and dehumanization experienced by the women, the novel calls into question and critiques the value of the patriarchal law at hand, as it harms the people it's supposedly made to protect and keep contained. I think this remains culturally significant nowadays, given that what was considered moral then and has historical significance from the past is not necessarily, given that it's a legal and used to be recognized as something legal. For example, the ways in which slavery, child labor, and the ways that minorities were disenfranchised back then, despite being qualified as something legal, that doesn't make it morally okay, and that delineates how we should not qualify our standard of ethical and moral righteousness to the ways that the law outlines them to be. As the world transforms, we should not be allowing ourselves to qualify what is okay and what is moral by what the government says is okay and what is moral. Going along as to my interpretation of the novel, I think it's also important to acknowledge why this novel matters now in our current contemporary society and modern culture. I think it's necessary to read books like these and novels that tackle issues such as these, as they serve to be cautionary tales for what could possibly come in our future. This novel uses historical facts and historical basis to question the fragility of our democracy and how it could fall ill to far-right groups across the globe, including in the US. Most notably, I think under a certain presidency, we've realized how easily our democracy revokes rights afforded to women and marginalized groups and minority groups that were only afforded to them recently. For example, the Dobbs versus Jackson decision was the landmark case which revoked Roe v. Wade, which had afforded women reproductive freedom for over 60 years and then provided them the federal right to reproductive health care, contraception, and abortions. In revoking it, we can see the subtle ways in which these governments are no longer separating church and state, but instead explicitly applying their religious beliefs in order to control women and their bodies. It also notes how women are also seemingly being targeted in the rollback of their own rights, which can be seen notably through things such as the SAVE Act, which would make it difficult for married women to vote. The act essentially disguising itself as making it safer and more secure to vote would actually make it difficult for women that no longer have their same last name on their birth certificate to vote themselves. And through small occurrences like these, we can note how small and subtle ways elicited by our government attempt to exert control over the population. To engage in further discussion beyond the lecture and engage with the audience, I think it'd be very interesting to cover these discussion questions that I've come up with. The first one being, despite being written decades ago in the 1980s, do you think the novel's feminist elements are too on the nose? By this I mean, do you think the novel spells out the subjugation and control and patriarchal ideals that were to oppress women so severely? Do you think these aspects are too obvious for people to discuss and converse beyond themselves and the discussion at hand, or do you think they're just clear enough for people to engage with and not necessarily have to know much or know the ideals that feminism is aligned with to discuss this novel? And second of all, I like to ask, do you think the novel poses a realistically probable future given the current far-right trends seeking to control and subjugate the marginalized, or is this perception and near-futuristic novel too far-fetched and extreme to actually occur? And once again, as I noted before, I think this interesting question would be necessary to tackle given the far-right trends that we're experiencing in our world nowadays, and the ways in which some of these governments are attempting to subtly and also not so subtly control the lives of marginalized groups. Thank you for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed this lecture.